Am I audible and clear and visible?
Yes.
Well, thanks, colleagues. I think we should start. I can see we've got quite a very good turnout. I think we should, without a waste of time, begin this PCC briefing on electricity planning recommendations. My name is Blessing Manali. I head the communications unit of the Presidential Climate Commission, and I'll be facilitating today's interaction. We will, in a minute or two, have Dr. Crispian Olva, who's on the program. We've got one of our commissioners, Commissioner Leboham Mulawisi, who's also one of the labor commissioners, as well as Mr. Steve Nichols, who heads our mitigation portfolio, the PCC. They'll mainly be taking us through the PCC recommendations, as well as some of the views from stakeholder perspectives. But I must acknowledge that in our midst, we've got numerous commissioners. I've seen Commissioner Nodea, who joined quite early, but I think as when then they join in, would acknowledge them. But you're welcome, and once again, thank you for heeding the invitation. And we did some previous background briefings on the subject, and colleagues would have all the information they require to continue to write the various stories as they develop. With that, welcome, and let me hand over to Dr. Crispian Olva.
Okay, thank you, Blessing, and a very good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for joining us. So maybe I could just start. I mean, I'm sure you all know this already, but just to reiterate, the Presidential Climate Commission was set up by the President about 2.5 years ago. We are a multi-stakeholder commission, so there are representatives on the commission from government, from business, from civil society, from young people, from local government, from the faith community, and from various organized labor bodies. So we represent a broad cross-section of stakeholders. Our job is to provide independent, impartial advice to government and, well, in fact, to all stakeholders, to society at large, about the climate transition, and specifically the transition to net zero by mid-century, as well as to a climate resilient future. And we do our work in two ways. We engage the science. So we look at all of the scientific work that is available on any particular issue, and we consult stakeholders, and we try and consult as widely as possible. We talk to all the main stakeholder groups. We take it down to community level consultations. I know it's never adequate. I mean, we can't reach every single community in the country, but we do try and solicit as broad a range of views as possible on any issue. And then as the Commission, we look at that material and we make recommendations. And to date, we've made 3 sets of recommendations. So the first was with respect to the updated nationally determined contribution. That sets out a broad emissions trajectory for the country with a particular focus on this period up to 2030. Secondly, we made recommendations on the just transition. That was handed over to government last year. And, you know, crucially, the reason we focused on the just transition was that we wanted to look at the economic and social consequences of the climate transition. And look at a proactive policy that seeks to ensure that this transition is equitable, that both the risks and the opportunities in the transition are equitably shared. And then at the president's request last year, when he launched this Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, we've also made recommendations on the JET IP. So those were released earlier this month. Many of you, I think, have already written pieces on our JET IP recommendations. And what we are doing today is releasing our fourth set of recommendations. And these are focusing more specifically on the electricity mix and the electricity planning process. And we're doing this, in fact, the spur for us doing this work was our strat planning session just over a year ago, at which Minister Mantashe asked the Commission to give him advice on what should go into the IRP and what our views were on the energy mix. So we've spent a year doing work in order to make those recommendations, and that's included a large amount of technical work and modeling work, which Steve will talk to later, and a very extensive process of stakeholder engagement. This work has been led by the Commission's Net Zero Pathways Working Group, and the chair of that working group is Lebogang Molaisi. She's one of our commissioners. She comes from COSATU. She represents COSATU on the Commission, and it's under her guidance that all of this energy planning and net zero modeling work has been undertaken. So it gives me a great sense of pride that, you know, a year-long process of work has now reached its culmination. And I do want to really extend my appreciation both to the working group and to Lebogang in particular, as well as the technical team that's done a lot of the hard work, and that's led by Steve Nichols and members of his team, including Simpiwe Ngwenya. So well done to them to get us to this point. So I'm going to hand over to Lebogang, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the process and the stakeholder views. And yeah, I look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crispian, and thanks for the introduction and kind of setting the scene for the work that has culminated to the process that we're engaging in today, where we are communicating the PCC's electricity planning recommendations. And like you've said, this is a year-long process that's culminated in a process of rigorous stakeholder engagement. I think it's safe to say, and we know this to be true, particularly for South Africa, that electricity is critical for development. It is in the national interest to resolve the electricity and energy crisis in a scientific and transparent manner. A clear plan for electricity in the short and long term can give our people hope, attract investment, bolster trade, reduce death and health impacts from poor air quality, avail water for agriculture, make a decisive contribution to meeting South Africa's carbon emission goals, and ultimately boost the economy and create jobs. A just transition is a significant opportunity that requires bold leadership and clear goals. Following a resolution at the February 2022 Presidential Climate Commission strategy session and a request in that meeting from Minister Mantashe, the PCC commissioners have made recommendations to the President on the critical steps that need to be taken to introduce justice and urgency into electricity planning in South Africa. These recommendations are based on a year-long stakeholder engagement process culminating in a national symposium in April this year. Stakeholders played a meaningful role in crafting these recommendations and setting ambition. The recommendations were well received by stakeholders and adopted at the very next colloquium. While the recommendations are intended to inform the integrated resource plan due for release in the next quarter, it also makes recommendations about the future and lends support to many of the initiatives government has in place to resolve load shedding, those already embodied in the President's Electricity Action Plan. These recommendations, therefore, take both a short and long-term view. They talk both about the IRP and critical steps for resolving the energy crisis, as well as climate and air quality compliant electricity systems for the long term. The recommendations set a bold way forward that would set the base for green reindustrialization and economic diversification in our country. All stakeholders unanimously identified the need for the centrality of a just transition. Abundant and affordable electricity will enable economic diversification and competitiveness. We must create additional jobs, and government should incentivize green industrial development, economic diversification, and the localization of key transition value chains, particularly in at-risk regions. Investing in human resources and skills development is an immediate priority. Integrated government planning needs to support those most affected by load shedding, particularly SMMEs and indigent households, as well as provide and enhance social protection measures, particularly for those workers and communities impacted by our transition to a low carbon economy. With the view that access to abundant and affordable energy will enable inclusive economic development, commissioners propose an IRP that maximizes renewable energy available on the grid. Regardless of assumptions made, the models analyzed all select renewables, storage, and peaking support as the optimal distribution of investment. This least cost mix should therefore be the basis for any IRP scenarios. If we adopt ambitious and clear goals in line with our development and just transition objectives, assuming high economic growth and ambition at the lower end of the national determined contributions, the PCC expects a policy-adjusted IRP to promote approximately 50 to 60 gigawatts of variable renewable energy by 2030, supported by storage and between 3 and 5 gigawatts of peaking support. Government needs to balance energy security, costs, economics, jobs, environment, and health in assessing these opportunities. A few key things enable all developmental scenarios. Firstly, if we are not able to resolve the inherent sustainability limitations of the current pricing system, we will perpetuate existing challenges and crises. The commissioners have called for an urgent review of electricity pricing. Secondly, stakeholders at the colloquium argued that the free basic electricity system should be reformed. Thirdly, we urgently need to upgrade the transmission and distribution grids. A penultimate enabler is building the capacity of local government. Local government has a fundamental role to play in electricity distribution, energy efficiency, and small-scale generation. Finally, where there is grid capacity, we need to locate early renewable energy construction, streamline bidding and grid access processes, and provide guidance for short and long-term investment. Commissioners therefore recommend a more spatial approach to electricity planning. Electricity planning is moving at a very fast pace, so modeling needs to be repeated often. The IRP must be updated every 2 years in order to be in line with these electricity plans. South Africa is in an electricity crisis in the short term. We must select technologies that are least cost, widely known, and quickest to get onto the grid. This means renewable energy backed by storage and peaking support. Regardless of 2030 views, we should be aiming for a rate of 6 to 8 gigawatts a year in the short term. We should also keep in mind the requirements of climate change. The latest IPCC 6th assessment report suggests that in order to give us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to decarbonize the power, including the electricity system, by the early 2040s. This means no power-based fossil fuels anywhere in the world after 2042. As a matter of principle, we cannot allow decommissioning of coal plants into a vacuum. The onus is on us to have built the alternative power and created alternative employment opportunities by then. Failure to roll out renewables will lead to further extension of coal plants, with consequences for cost and reliability. Given the aging existing infrastructure, we can't afford to miss rollout targets. In this broad context, what South Africa really needs is united leadership supporting a set of ambitious goals that enable inclusive economic prosperity. An ambitious renewable energy-based power system will restore continuous access to electricity, enable economic growth, reduce impact on human health, increase water availability, potentially improve food security, enable trade competitiveness, enhance access to capital, and enable economic diversification and the creation of jobs. Those are just the broad and high-level recommendations that have been made by the PCC in terms of electricity planning. Thanks, Crispian. I think we'll then hand over to Steve to give us further details on the recommendations. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Steve Nichols, can you proceed to give in some of the technical background and the thinking in addition to the stakeholder perspectives, so that we could then follow that with a question and answer section from the media present. We can do a facility verbally. Thank you. Steve, you may proceed.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to Bokhang for that excellent summary. Some of the stuff I have will be a slide repetition, but I'll go through that quickly and rather open up for questions. So just to sort of describe the stakeholder engagement process we followed in a little bit more detail. The first phase and the last half of last year were a bunch of technical engagements where we engaged with stakeholders to share some of the latest science and some of the thinking from key players like Eskom. And with each of these phases, we would have these extended commissioner working group meetings so that we were able to discuss amongst the commissioners what was emerging out of these engagements. The second rather intensive phase was the first quarter of this year, where we engaged with specific stakeholder groups as well as communities. So we engaged with labor, business, government, civil society, youth, the faith movement, but also had one or two community level engagements. And again, had an extended commissioners working group to help internalize the learning from that process. And then from April to May, focused on this colloquium where we presented the draft recommendations to stakeholders, was backed up by a little bit of research. And in fact, over the whole period, we were doing background research. So it was kind of the broad process, and that's resulted in 3 reports for your review. The first is an unedited reflection on what stakeholders were saying, and this is a shot of the cover with the National Colloquium event. And yeah, so it's really just trying to collate what different stakeholders were saying for your review. The second is the technical report. So we have a technical report that details the research that we did, how we came to our conclusions. And both of those informed the recommendations report, which is a much shorter, easier report to read. It's 12 pages plus a 2-page appendix, which really kind of summarizes what we took from the engagements in the research. So really just to re-emphasize what Lebogang said, the key recommendations for the sort of long-term planning of electricity is focused around the spatial planning approach, centralizing the transmission and distribution grids in how we plan electricity. So, for example, there's not a lot of grid evacuation capacity in the Northern Cape, but there is more available in Gauteng and in Mpumalanga, for example. And so focusing on where there's immediately available access to the grid, as well as thinking about what investments are needed in the long term to make that long-term access to renewables more feasible is a key part of that planning. But that spatial approach also allows a number of other things. It allows us to think about where this infrastructure is going to be built, and therefore what kind of skills and skills development do we need, what kind of retraining do we need. It also allows us to think about things like road upgrades and port upgrades, and that allow us to build this infrastructure as quickly as possible. So this was something that was raised by several stakeholders and very well received. The second point was this issue around pricing and the fact that the current pricing system is unsustainable, both for Eskom, but also for municipalities. So I think one of the things that I personally learned over this year was the sort of real central importance of local governments in this process. So when we think about the grid, we often think just about the transmission grid, but we also need to be thinking very carefully about the distribution grid and the business models that support the maintenance of that business, distribution grid. And as the energy system changes, so too does that business model need to change. So a lot of work needs to be done in thinking about pricing reform and how we make the institutions responsible for the governance of electricity more sustainable. The other thing that came up in a lot of detail was the role of free basic electricity, and that if we do change this pricing system, it can't be at the expense of the poor. And so thinking about reform of the free basic electricity system in parallel to pricing reform is critically important. And stakeholders cited research by Perry that suggests that only about 30% of free basic electricity reaches consumers and households. And also the amount, currently about 50 kilowatt hours per household per month, is insufficient. And recommended 350 kilowatt hours per month is more sustainable. And then the third area, which really was the bulk of the feedback we received, is that this process has to be run in a just way. And we spent a lot of time talking about procedural, distributional, and restorative justice, and many justice elements were raised. And so I want to highlight that these were the three that were most common and received the most weight in terms of support, but there were many others. For example, the role of gender in the energy transition. The three areas that came up most was this need to incentivize green industrialization and economic diversification, and sort of particularly thinking about key value chains in the transition and regions that are at risk. Investing in human resources and skills development is a really key priority, and then supporting those impacted by load shedding, particularly SMMEs and the poor, as well as enhancing social protection measures, particularly for those that might be transitioned out of their existing roles. A last point that I would raise that's not in the recommendations, but that came up consistently throughout the colloquium, was this idea that energy planning is really essential to development and should be done in as transparent and scientific means as possible. A little bit of extra detail on these just transition elements, given their importance. I mean, skills development requires us to be able to think about industries of the future. So this industrialization, diversification, and skills development are really closely linked. And we need to be understanding how we will invest in our economy in the future over and above just electricity. What does that green electricity enable our economy to do is a key question. And so, identifying how we will develop those skills to meet those future needs is a really important part of the process. And the PCC have a partnership with DHET, where we're thinking about this and how to process this more effectively, as well as be more effective in how we model future opportunities. The core is industrialization and diversification. And so the example I often use is if we manage to do a one-for-one job swap from jobs that might be lost in coal to those gained in renewables, unemployment in Mpumalanga would still be 40%. And so we have to be able to deliver more jobs to those regions. And so thinking about developing other competitive industries is really important, as well as supporting services to those industries. And then finally, social protection. So it's possible that not everybody will be catered for in this transition. And so providing traditional social protection measures is key, but as well as improving basic services, which we hear over and over when we get into our stakeholder engagement sessions. And really this allows resilience and adaptability of communities if they have access to free basic electricity, if they're getting services like water and sanitation, they are better equipped to build their skills base and take advantage of new opportunities. So these are kind of a cluster of centrally important things that we need to get right in parallel to the electricity technical transition. The stakeholder debate really centers around this phrase that the president used in the State of the Nation address. We will continue our just transition to a low carbon economy at a pace our country can afford and in a manner that ensures energy security. And I think this phrase, pace that our country afford, and what we define as energy security really it summarizes the debate perfectly. This is kind of where much of the discussion in our stakeholder sessions was centered. And so at the pace we can afford was really characterized by two extremes of the arguments. Some stakeholders feeling we should be doing a slower transition, and they were typically concerned with a couple of things. First of all, that high variable renewable energy penetration systems are not secure. Secondly, that the economic cost of coal closure on jobs and livelihoods is too high. So worried about people in those coal value chains. And then concerns that once you factor in ancillary services, variable renewable energy prices are not competitive. The point there being that you can't compare wind energy on its own to coal energy on its own, because wind requires a bunch of other things like storage and transmission upgrades, that kind of bring the costs closer. Generally, the science is supporting that even with those additional ancillary services, variable renewable energy systems have a lower cost at a system level. And then the science around renewable energy penetration suggests that these are definitely possible, certainly at the levels of penetration we're talking about in our recommendations. But on this top point, there is some further work needed to be done around thinking about the security of these systems once you get to sort of 70–80% levels of penetration. But even then, a lot of the technology is available to solve those problems. Of course, concern for people in the coal value chain is important. And so a lot of the recommendations that we made are centered around those concerns. Then there are those that argue for a faster transition, and the bulk of their argument is around if we are able to transition faster, we would have enhanced access to capital, both at lower costs from private capital, but also supported by international support like we've seen in the JET-IP. Enhancing trade competitiveness. We all know that Europe and the UK are banning the sale of the internal combustion engine post 2030, 2035. And so this impacts our ability to sell vehicles into those markets. And so our ability to produce green commodities like green iron actually give us enhanced access to more markets, and also highlights some needs for parallel transitions in other sectors. Increased geopolitical influence. South Africa has traditionally punched above its weight in terms of the size of our economy and our geopolitical influence, and this kind of transition really enhances that. And then, of course, the key components of reducing the impacts of climate change, and we think particularly of water availability and food security, but also we know that climate change impact the poor the most, and so to neglect this component of our planning would impact the poor, make them worse off than they currently are. And of course, a finally very topical and important component of this argument is reducing the impact of air pollution, which impact the health and shorten lives of people in these regions. So all that culminated in a recommendation by stakeholders and commissioners to do the analysis based on the energy trilemma, which was originally coined by the World Energy Council, which really asked us to look at energy systems across three components: energy security, how reliable and stable are the systems, energy equity, how affordable and accessible are they, and then sustainability in the original coining, thinking about climate change, water and health type issues. But obviously in South Africa, we have this additional social dimension of jobs and livelihoods. So the sort of research process that we undertook, we reviewed 15 different scenarios across 3 major studies that were conducted around net zero transitions in the electricity sector, including those by the UCT, Energy Group, CSIR, and then the NBI. We then analyzed each of those scenarios against this framework of equity, security, socioeconomic and environmental sustainability, to produce this sort of summary table, and then also looked at each of them in terms of the kinds of energy mix they were recommending based on the assumptions used. So when we analyzed each of those scenarios against the sort of criteria of the trilemma, we found that across the board, the more ambitious decarbonization scenarios were beneficial, with the one exception perhaps of affordability, in the sense that if we accelerate renewable rollout, you get a slightly higher electricity price, but that increase is relatively small compared to the benefits that you get. I'm not going to go through that in super detail. It is in the technical report, and so you're welcome to ask us questions as you get the chance to read through it. When we looked at the modeling, the modeling is, sensitive. There's this famous quote by George Box that I'm sure you have all heard, is all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so what it does allow us to do is test the complexity of our assumptions. So sometimes we make assumptions that you don't fully understand how they knock on through the system, but also, a range of assumptions will give you a range of different answers. So we went and looked at all of these different studies, and what was interesting is this kind of least cost anchor. It didn't really matter what assumptions you used in the modeling. What would happen is you would build renewables plus storage and peaking support as the least cost solution. And so this gives us very strong and clear direction around the kinds of things that should be in the system. Now, the models have the option to choose all technologies. So in the models are coal and gas and nuclear of different kinds. And typically they don't build new coal and they don't build nuclear. And so the least cost option, regardless of assumptions, is renewable storage and peaking support. Just a quick reminder on the science, and Lebogang mentioned this, but it's sometimes useful to see it visually. In their IPC assessment of how we get to a 1.5 degree world, different sectors have to decarbonize at different rates, depending on how easy it is, what available technologies there are. And in their modeling, the electricity sector and the energy supply sector have to decarbonize by the early 2040s. So that means no carbon emissions from these sectors. And so either you have to use carbon capture and storage, or you have to phase these technologies out of your system. And I guess it's important to note at this point that carbon capture and storage is not really a feasible technology for electricity and power, because the coal-fired power plants that you would use them on are already not competitive when compared to renewable energy. So if you add an additional layer of cost to sequester, transport, and store the carbon, they just become less competitive. So CCS is an important technology in the decarbonization of other sectors, in particular heavy industry, but we don't see that as a viable technology in the power sector. So that does have the implication that we need to decarbonize our power sectors by 2040-ish, early 2040s, if we are to meet our goal of 1.5 degrees. And I would make the point that the science is very conservative. So this is to give us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And so the urgency of electricity decarbonization, I think, is pretty stark. In the short term, as Lebogang mentioned, we have an energy crisis, and many people ask the question, would the need to solve this short-term crisis change the decisions that we might make? And the answer is no, and here's a slide from Eskom that basically shows the costs and the timing for putting different types of technology onto the grid, and confirm that only the sort of PV, wind, and peaking support type technologies are able to get onto the system, and we add batteries to that. that in the timeframes that we need to urgently resolve load shedding. So even in the short term, you would focus on renewable energy. So all of that led to some very specific recommendations for the IRP. At a minimum, we should be investing in least cost pathways that I mentioned, and then also seek the opportunity to accelerate the transition. And so obviously we have the short-term goal of solving load shedding and energy security, but we should also in the medium term look to accelerate the transition. Especially in the short term, the PCC thinks that renewable energy is the correct solution. Can build it quickly. We know it. It's cheap, and these are kinds of the technology principles that we should be focusing on. As we've mentioned, investing in upgrading and expanding the grid, both at a transmission and distribution level, is essential, and hints to our spatial planning approach. So if you take all of these assumptions that go into the models and you make assumptions in line with our development and just transition objectives, the models show that you would have about 50 to 60 gigawatts of variable renewable energy by 2030, supported by co-located storage and storage in general, and between 3 and 5 gigawatts of peaking support. And so this really then forms the basis of our recommendations for the IRP. But in the short term, as Lebogang mentioned, regardless of your 2030 views, in the short term, building renewables is the only immediate answer. And so building at least 8 gigawatts in a year in the next 2 to 4 years will help resolve load shedding, will put us on the track to this long-term target of 50 to 60 gigawatts. And then we can review progress as we go along, which emphasizes the importance of repeating the IRP regularly, at least every 2 years, ideally annually. Because then you're able to respond to changes. And so, depending on what assumptions you use in the models, you do get a relatively high level of variability. And so we're able to refine those assumptions, do further studies as we move along. But certainly in the short term, clear answer is focus on getting renewables onto the grid with associated storage and peaking support. The game changer in all of this is energy efficiency. And so this should be our first port of call. It does require a lot of behavior change, and so slightly on the risky side. But if we're able to put in a proper energy, countrywide energy system campaign, and we get a lot of adoption, you can drop the level that's needed to have a stable system with renewables. And so you could put, even as little as 40 gigawatts of renewables in the system. But again, these things are elements of risk, and to emphasize our point around planning, regular planning allows you to respond to the uptake of things like energy efficiency. So I'll kind of wrap it up there. It gives you a quick sort of view into what happened in the stakeholder engagements, how we structured the technical research, and then how that led to the various solutions that we've had. And very happy to take some questions. Thank you. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Steve and colleagues. The floor is now open for members of the media who would like to comment or raise questions to both Dr. Alva, Commissioner Mulaisi, as well as Mr. Steve Nichols. I must also just outline that, of course, there will be requests for media interviews with the broader commissioners whose specific constituencies you might want to go into deeper dive on the issues, particularly labor, business, youth, other sectors, and the religious community. So also feel free after this interaction to ask for additional interviews and more information. But now the floor is open. Thank you very much, Steve. Do I have a first taker?
Hello?
Proceed.
Hello? Yeah. Yes, thank you. I have a question for Mr. Nichols. I have sort of two questions, if you don't mind. First, can you speak to the robustness of a decentralized energy system and the role of gas in creating such a system? And secondly, I know there's no plans for new coal, and there's plans for reducing emissions and increasing the reliability of the coal fleet, but can you speak to if there's been any discussion or consideration of a closure schedule for existing power stations?
Thanks. We will take a few questions and have Steve and the rest of the people responding, of the team responding. But can I just request that you introduce yourselves formally, we cannot assume that the names that we see on the screens are your names. Thanks. Nojan, I think I saw a hand from you.
Yes, sorry, that was me just speaking. I forgot to introduce myself with my name.
Okay, that was that. So you raised the hand after speaking. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? I may not be able to see the hands. You may want to pitch in once, as long as you're not disrupting anyone. Any other takers? Or Steve, do you want to go for that and maybe it will trigger follow-up questions?
I see there's a question from Clement.
Oh, Clement, proceed.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. I just want to know, due to PCC, the acceleration of renewable energy is vital due to contract. But now, like Quebec, lifespan of Quebec is ending 2024. And then now also our grid is still connected on this single supply of Quebec. Now, what's going to be, because next year, the lifespan of Quebec is ending, and now we have to accelerate the renewable. Thanks.
Thank you, Clement. Other hands? Okay, thank you, Steve.
I see Nick has got his hand up.
Nick.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Proceed, Nick.
I had two questions, if that's okay. One was just based on the PCC's modeling and assuming that its recommendations are implemented, what would South Africa's electricity mix be in 2030? And that's percentage contribution from each technology for the year. And the second one was, in any of this work, has the PCC considered, maybe it's a separate work stream. Sorry, I'm Nick Headley. Maybe this is a separate work stream, but has the PCC considered changes to the municipal funding model in its work, just considering how decentralization will impact municipal revenues? Thanks.
Thanks. I think we can go for those three questions, but colleagues that have already asked questions, just put on the chat the platform or the media group you come from after asking the questions, so that just for the record and to have a sense of future relations. Thanks. Steve, you can go for the responses.
Sure. Yeah, I'll have a go, and the commissioners and Crispin can jump in if needed. Yeah, so to your question, Nojan, thank you for calling me Mr. Nichols. No one's done that in a long time. But from direct answers, so your question about robustness of decentralized systems, I think refers to the level of renewables penetration that you might have and how you balance the grid and the system in that process. And so this is a key question. And then you specifically asked about the role of gas. So when we refer to peaking support in our modeling, what we're basically saying is if the renewables are not able to provide power because the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining, you need some kind of backup support that is able to ramp up very quickly. And kind of fill those gaps. And even though that sort of filler power is probably more expensive than your main forms of renewable power, the balance of the system is still very affordable. And so currently in that peaking role, you have to think about the time period over which you need peaking. And so for short peaking, 2 hours, 4 hours, you would use battery storage. And for slightly longer, you would use a combination of battery storage and pumped hydro if you have that available. And obviously that's an important area for us to be thinking about in South Africa, is how do we develop our pumped hydro resources. And then over longer periods, you need something that's that you can sort of run for longer periods. And so when we talk about interseasonal peaking, so peaking support over winter, for example, you would at the moment probably use gas. We're looking at other technology alternatives. So obviously gas is a fossil fuel and you would prefer not to have that in the system, but over those longer periods, gas is the thing that models are selecting. Some of the models are also exploring things like the use of coal running at low utilizations, and Germany's experimented with some of this. And we also see the IEA looking at that particular option. And so you can keep your coal plants longer on the system, but they run for very short periods of time between, over the key winter periods when you need that kind of support. So we think that these systems are very robust to your question, but obviously we need to be very conscious of these issues when we're implementing our renewable energy rollout. Your question about the plans of new coal, yes, none of the models predict or choose new coal. Your question was about existing coal, and so there are a couple of options there. Do we extend the life of coal plants for 1 or 2 years to support with the immediate problem? If we didn't have the load shedding problem, that would not be a least cost solution. You probably wouldn't even consider it, but it may be a solution in the short term to extend them for 1 or 2 years, but not longer than that. If you extend them for longer than that, you put the NDC at risk, and also, there are cheaper options in terms of building renewables to fill that gap. And the other question is about electricity availability factor. You would want to increase the electricity availability factor because it gives you more flexibility in the system, but we should distinguish between EAF and load factor. So EAF is the potential to burn coal in your plant, whereas load factor is what you actually do. So you would want to increase EAF to improve flexibility, but you would limit load factor depending on your climate and cost goals. There is a need to reassess the closure schedule. So we use closure schedules in the modeling that align with what we already know, more or less aligned with IRP and the closure updates in some of Eskom's documents. But this is a step that we're taking now. We're working with the project management unit of the JET IP to model proposed new closure schedules. Clement, to your question, I think your question really emphasizes the need to keep this planning ongoing, and doing IRP much more frequently, because big assumptions that exist in the model, for example, is that Kuiberg will continue. So the refurbishment of Kuiberg and the life extension of Kuiberg will be successful, and we will have that nuclear available on the grid. If that was to not be successful, well, then you would definitely need more renewables, as you suggest. Hopefully it will be successful because it puts more pressure on the grid if it's not. But of course, that's these are the assumptions that you make in the model. Nick, to your question, the percentage contribution for each technology in 2030 is a question that I cannot answer off the top of my head, knowing all of the numbers. But if we did roll out into that range of 50-60 gigawatts, the penetration of renewables would be around 40%. So it would be in line with sort of leading countries as they are today. But obviously other countries will accelerate to that point as well and beyond by 2030. And then your question about changing municipal revenue models, that's key. We have not looked at that yet, but it has become a clear thing that we need to look at, and it's the basis of our recommendation around pricing model reform. And we recommend that the presidency run that study. We think that's a very important study. And it's not linked just to electricity, it's linked to the sustainability of municipal pricing or revenue models in general. And so that is a really key area. There are a couple of further studies that are needed that are being done. So one is that pricing model. The other is a much more granular grid assessment of sort of balancing the grid at grid level. And then the last is the finances. And so this is a study that the SA Tide, DBSA, NPC and ourselves are kicking off, is to look at how do we fund this? Where does the capital come from? What does it do to Forex risk? What does it do to balance of payments? So those three studies I think are important and are in the pipeline. Thanks. I'll hand back to Blessing. And is anyone else wants to jump?
Thank you very much, Steve. Can I request for any other colleagues who've got more questions to proceed? Unless Dr. Olva and Commissioner Molaisi has got any other additional points. Crispy and Lebogang? We seem to
Blessing, I see there's a question from Nokukanya from Eyewitness News. I wonder if she wants to ask it. And then Deneen Erasmus also has a hand up.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yes, Nokukanya, it's on the chat. Do you want to proceed and ask that question? And then Nick, you can come back again.
I mean, I can read the question and answer it from my side. And, yeah.
Let's do that.
But maybe let Deneen ask her question as well. And Nick has asked a question in the chat that I think is actually closely related to Nokukanya's question.
Okay. Proceed.
Hi, it's Deneen Erasmus from Business Day. Could you talk a bit about how the recommendations have been received by the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy and also the Minister of Electricity? There still seems to be quite a lot of support, especially from the DMRE, for including new nuclear in a revised IRP. And yeah, just in general, how this has been received by government. And then also, do you have any idea when this revised IRP is going to be available? Are we still going to see it this year?
Thanks, Denise. Nokukanya seems to be having a problem with her audio, but she has asked if I can go through that quickly from Eyewitness News. There seems to be a renewed drive by some ministers to keep coal plants on for longer, and what appears to be mixed messages about decarbonizing. Does the PCC get the same sense that government is committed to meeting the 2040 deadline? Has there been any pushback? In the broader sense, what are the cost implications of achieving the recommendation put by the president? Did the consultation process include cost exercises? Thanks, colleagues.
Would you like me to reply to Deneen's question, Steve, or do you want to do it?
You go ahead, I can supplement.
Okay, so just to say, we have handed the recommendations to government. So we sent them to the president. The president's office has forwarded it to NECOM and to the members of cabinet. And we also submitted, because the Minister for Mineral Resources and Energy had asked for this, we submitted the recommendations directly to him as well. We've not had any formal response yet from government. I mean, I wouldn't have expected it so quickly. What the president did indicate to us, we organized a prior briefing session with him. This is about 6 weeks ago. And he expressed his appreciation for the work that we've done, and a commitment that government would take these recommendations seriously and study them very carefully. And I think that's all that we can ask for. I mean, obviously note there have been various statements. I think the Minister for Mineral Resources and Energy had his budget speech in Parliament. He spoke in that speech about coal, nuclear. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say there's probably not going to be unanimity in government around these recommendations. But we do think that there are areas in which we can converge. So, some issues may not, reach full agreement, but I think there are others where it'll be relatively easy to get on the same page. And I'm thinking in particular of, the short-term solution to the energy crisis. You've got to look at what can you get to market within the next 2 to 3 years at the outside, and in a least cost manner. And that aligns pretty closely with what we're saying. You know, it's basically wind, solar, batteries, and some form of peaking power. Those are what, you know, you can use to address the current energy crisis. And I'm not sure there'd be much dispute around it. I think you'll find that there's a convergence around those technologies. The other area where I think government's clearly already moving in the direction we've recommended is on the spatial planning approach to the electricity grid, and looking at how to use the existing grid capacity to its maximum, even while we roll out the grid upgrading. And that's a further area where I think everyone is aligned. I mean, upgrading the grid, extending it, putting in place the 8,500 kilometers of transmission lines that the ESCOM Transmission Development Plan talks about. You know, these are things that I think we fully aligned on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
I would. Can I go ahead, Jesse?
Proceed.
Yeah, so I guess I would just add to that the president in one of his recent speeches re-emphasized the need to commit to the NDC and to a longer-term net zero goal. So you know, although there is a certain amount of healthy debate, I do think that the general direction is supported in answer to your question, Nkanya. The question about prices and costs that have been asked by both Nick and Nkanya. The modeling does show a slight increase in price for the ambitious scenarios, because what you're doing is you're accelerating renewables onto the grid, but that price is relatively small. I would, however, say though that the modeling on that there isn't a huge amount of different references. Both UCT and NBI look at that specific question and conclude, you know, relatively small increases of in the range of 3 to 6%. And to Nick, your specific question, compared to the IRP, which the UCT estimated at about 10% higher than the IRP. All of this is in the technical report. I would say though that, you know, we would want to do more studies on that. And so part of why we're working with the DBSA, SA Tide, the National Planning Commission, is on those specific questions. What are we looking at from a cost perspective? And there we can look at much more detailed analysis, for example, of differential borrowing rates across different types of technologies. And so it's getting more and more expensive to fund coal, for example, partly because of decisions made by banks to not continue funding coal, and partly because of an inability to insure coal, which then, of course, pushes your capital costs up. So yes, the studies are showing a slight increase in price in order to manage that enhanced transition, although that is still cheaper than the increase in price on the IRP. But we do think that needs some more work. Then the question specifically about the DMRE. The DMRE are very concerned about whether these high penetration renewable energy systems are secure or not. And given their role in decision making, one can understand that. And so that is really the basis of their biggest concern. And we have agreed with them to sort of meet and share knowledge and expertise and bring some experts to that conversation as well. And so an ongoing conversation there. I think we've answered all of those questions. If I missed something, please trigger me again.
No, thanks, Steve. There is one question in the chat about any update on beneficiaries that have started benefiting as a result of closures, particularly workers from a reskilling point of view. That question, of course, belongs to the JET IP discussion, but I think that Dr. Alva can give a short answer about what we are doing in Mpumalanga around the employment strategy specifically. It's from Nandi from F News.
Okay, no, thank you. Let me try and respond to that. So Nandi, I mean, as far as I'm aware, there have been no coal mines that have closed yet as a result of the transition. I mean, as you've all probably been following, you know, global coal demand peaked as a result of the war in Ukraine and this energy crisis that was triggered. And South Africa's coal producers have benefited enormously from that surge in demand. That is starting to tail off. And our big concern is that coal demand is going to drop dramatically as we move into the 2030s. So hence the urgency for planning around the just transition. I mean, this is why what Steve was talking about, the skills development, the industrial development, the social support packages, all need to be maneuvered into place in the matter of you know, the next year or so. We are actively engaged in that. There's a number of existing initiatives that are starting to hit the ground. There's quite substantial funds allocated for these areas in the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. The final details of that are being put together and will be released by the President's office shortly. There was a major, what we call Just SA project launched a few months ago. This is with some of the JET IP funding coming through the German side. And there are a number of initiatives that are now underway, including some large-scale renewable energy projects. There's, in fact, 3,500 megawatts of 3 projects led by Seriti Green is one, Enetrag is another, Earthenwire is a third. And we are actively engaged in making those projects succeed and dealing with all the regulatory obstacles that, you know, these projects typically have to grapple with. So there's a lot underway, and it is urgent. You know, we need to make sure that we have active economic alternatives as we start to hit these coal closures.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver. I don't see any other questions on the chat. And I think it's because we've done a series of background briefings leading to this, but also because I think we've generally been open with accessing of documents ahead of this. But I just wanted to, before we close, maybe call upon Commissioner Mulaisi to emphasize any other matter, and then we could formally thank everybody and wait for one-on-one requests for more interviews.
Sorry, Blessing, I see Deneen has her hand up again.
Oh, Deneen, you can proceed.
Thanks. Just one more question. Sorry. So I just wanted to, if these recommendations are implemented, does that put South Africa on the track to meet the 2030 NDC target of reducing emissions by 22 to 33%?
Yes, it would be on the lower end.
Steve, do you want to repeat that response?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, it would be on the lower end of the NDC if we implemented these recommendations.
Thank you very much. So we are on track. We're on a 6-year roller coaster ride towards 2030. Okay, without any pedal fueling. Commissioner Mulaisi?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Blessing, and thank you to Dr. Oliver for giving the responses to the various questions, and to Steve and the Secretariat team for supporting this work for the past year, and particularly to the Net Zero working group that's been working in conjunction with the Secretariat to come up with these recommendations. I think the views that have come out of these recommendations is really to put South Africa on the track to address the fourth crisis that we're currently dealing with, which is the crisis of energy insecurity. We believe that through the centrality of a just transition in the manner in which we address the electricity crisis, we can also address the first three crises of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. I think what we do understand as part of these processes is that these issues are complex. Often there are contradictions that do emerge. But I think through the request from the colloquium from stakeholders for there to be a scientific base for recommendations, as well as through the assumptions of the IRP to put forward the least cost solutions, we do believe that the recommendations emanating from the work of the PCC do have support, particularly in terms of when you look at its alignment to the President's energy plans and action plans that have already been put in place. So with that said, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this briefing, and we look forward to more conversations moving forward. Thanks, Blessing.
Thank you very much, colleagues. There are a few questions in the chat who will pass. There is a colleague who asked about the repo rate and the just transition. So I think we'll link you up with our climate finance team. They'll tell you what happens when the cost of borrowing goes up and where people start spending money and on the cost of electricity and borrowing for solar, etc. So of course, any change in the repo rate affects where people spend their money, and that might be money they were keeping for savings to retrofit their houses or businesses. So we must keep the cost of borrowing low, even for our own international loan book. But we can have a discussion with the PCC, and would really appreciate if you would write a good story about the cost of borrowing domestically and internationally. But that said, once again, thank you, everybody, and we look forward to an engagement. You must look forward to more PCC engagement in this space, including one of the oversight visits we want to undertake to Mpumalanga with the entire commission to go and look into progress on the Komati just transition implementation stages. Thank you very much, colleagues, and have a good afternoon further.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Thank you.